Hello, everybody. This feels very nice, very cozy. Welcome to the Holly Bush Mansion, and particularly warm welcome those of you who have. How many people have not been in the mansion before? All right, so a lot of you, right? I hope you had a chance to look around. We will have some time afterward as well, so if you didn't, please do kind of look around this very, very historic house from about 1850. It has ghosts. It has ghosts. Anyway, my name is, for those of you I don't know, my name is Stephen Haig. I'm a history professor. I'm also the director of the Holly Bush Institute here at Rowan. Holly Bush takes its name from this mansion, which was, if you don't know, the site of a 1967 superpower summit between the U.S. President Lyndon Johnson and the Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin. And so not only our name, the Holly Bush Institute, but our mission to study global peace and security and international affairs here at Rowan was inspired by the Glassboro Summit, which was a point in time where the U.S. and the USSR were trying to get along better. Lyndon Johnson later called the series of meetings that took place here and the sort of ideas inspired by them, the spirit of Glassboro, the spirit of sort of friendship and international amity. So in line with that, we do host a number of programs over the course of the semester. We hope you'll come back and attend some of those. We're delighted to have Professor Benjamin Nathans from the University of Pennsylvania here for our first Holly Bush Author Series talk of the semester. Before I turn it over to my colleague, Professor Heinsohn, to introduce our speaker, just want to say a few words of thanks. I'd like to particularly shout out to Dr. Debbie Sharnack in the History Department, the Deputy Director of Holly Bush, who was helpful in putting this together. Professor Emily Blank over here, Director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies, which also supports our work, the International Studies Program, and also the Chess Dean's Office, which helps which underpins all of the activities and programs that we do. So I think that's about it for me. I hope everybody's comfortable in your various kinds of historic chairs that we've gathered from the mansion. And so what I'd like to do is just introduce Professor Jim Heinsohn, our Soviet specialist in the History Department, who will introduce our speaker. So please welcome.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. It's great to see so many friendly faces who I haven't seen in a long time. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Ben Nathans. So Ben Nathans is a professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches Soviet history. He earned his PhD at the University of California at Berkeley. His first book was called Beyond the Pale, The Jewish Encounter with Late Imperial Russia, which won several book prizes, including the Koret Prize in Jewish History, the Vicinage Prize in Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies, and the Lincoln Prize in Russian History. So in my field, that is a complete sweep. We met in Moscow in 1991 amid the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union. We both happened to be graduate students there. When the country was falling apart completely, we were there for the year to witness a revolution, a nonviolent revolution, but really interesting time that shaped both of our worldviews and certainly our scholarly life. His current book, which is for sale here, is titled To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement. This is, I've read this book complete from beginning to end. It's a really fascinating book. It's really beautifully written as well. And Professor Nathans would be more than happy to sign your copy. It would make, I think, for a great Valentine's gift for your beloved. And remember, the parade is tomorrow too. So can you imagine giving this to your beloved at the parade? So Professor Nathans is also known as a very thoughtful commentator on contemporary Russian events. His writing is featured in the New York Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement, and other places. He writes and he talks and is interviewed quite a bit about Putin, about the 3-year-old Russian war of aggression against the Ukraine, We're coming up on the 3-year anniversary of it in a week or two, and he's also very interested in the democratic opposition to Putin, such as it is, and I'm sure he'd be happy to answer questions about that topic as well. One fun fact about Ben, so we were both, as undergraduates, we did study abroad. Ben, I think, was right in his immediate postgraduate year. We both did study abroad in Russia. And I had a lot of adventures. I studied in Moscow. But Ben, who is a very talented piano player, somehow hooked up with a jazz band in communist Russia and went around to different places playing with this jazz band as a 21-year-old. So very interesting life experiences. I should have been holding this, I guess. But, so without any further delay, I would just like to introduce Ben Nathan.
Thank you, Jim. Put this up here. Thank you, Jim. Does this need to be here, this thing? I guess so. Okay. It's great to be here. This has got to be one of the most beautiful and intimate settings for a talk on any topic. I'm really wowed by this mansion and this room in particular with this beautiful crown molding. As Jim said, we've known each other since 1991, and we've been conducting a conversation about Russia and the Soviet Union pretty much ever since. He did read the entire book in manuscript and gave me, what he didn't say was that he gave me his comments and feedback, which helped make it a lot better and saved me from some truly stupid mistakes. So I'm grateful for that too. So my instructions are, we're going to spend about 35 minutes in the talk phase, and then we're just going to open things up to Q&A. And as Jim said, you can ask me anything you want about the history of the Soviet dissident movement, but I'm happy to speak about current affairs. I know that some of you are from particular classes in the history department, and while I won't speak to anything Latin American, anything having to do with the eastern half of Europe or Russia and the Soviet Union, I'd be happy to try to speak about. So the topic of my talk is the history of the Soviet dissident movement. This is a story that begins in the early 1960s and is effectively over because the movement has been destroyed by the KGB in the early 1980s. The first thing I want to say about this movement is that it was never supposed to happen. It was never supposed to be possible to have a public movement of dissent inside the Soviet Union. And it was not supposed to be possible because, according to Western theories of what kind of society the Soviet Union was, it was totalitarian. In other words, it had a state that aspired to total control over its population, and therefore open dissent was supposed to be unthinkable. The problem with that theory is that it dated from the sort of high point of building the socialist system from the Stalin years, the 1930s and 1940s, when in fact this kind of open questioning of certain Soviet practices would have been impossible. Or I guess I should put that a different way. Anyone who dared dissent in public, like the people that I study from the 1960s and 70s, would have been immediately arrested and either sent to a labor camp or executed in a basement somewhere. And it's a sign of how inadequate the totalitarian theory had become by the 1960s and 1970s. My argument in this book is that we really can't understand the Soviet Union in the second half of its history, the half that comes after Stalin died, right? The revolution is in 1917. Stalin comes to power in the late 1920s, rules for 25 years, longer than any other Soviet leader, although soon to be not as long as Putin. But when Stalin dies in 1953, having won the Second World War and utterly transformed this country from top to bottom, something fundamental changes. In fact, I would go so far to say, I'll just plant this seed in your mind if you want to think about it over the next few minutes. I would go so far to say that the change in Russia in 1953 to 1956, the period immediately after Stalin died, was more dramatic than the change in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and was replaced by something that has become today's Russian Federation under Putin. That's a controversial thing to say because we think of the collapse of the Soviet Union as the most dramatic finale of this 74-year history, starting in 1917. But in my view, Soviet history has two acts. The first act, 1917 to 1953, is extraordinarily violent. It begins during World War I. It continues with a civil war inside Russia. It goes through multiple famines in which millions of people die. It includes the great purges of the 1930s when Stalin's security apparatus is arresting and in some cases killing hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of people. The first half of Soviet history culminates, in terms of the drama, with the Second World War, which, as you know, the Soviet Union wins against Nazi Germany. It's the one country in Europe that's invaded by the Nazis and succeeds in driving them back all the way to Berlin. So for sheer human as well as historical drama, I don't think anything can match the first act of Soviet history. 1 out of every 6 adults, 18 million Soviet citizens, spends time in the Gulag, in the network of forced labor camps. That's an extraordinary number, 1 in 6 adults. So it's a mass phenomenon, the experience of state punishment and state terror. Most of them, of course, are completely innocent. The second half of Soviet history is a kind of grand experiment, an experiment run by Stalin's successors. And the question that they put on the agenda is, can we continue to run this socialist system, which is, I think the light switch just got hit there. Is that a sign? Can we continue to run this socialist system, whose goal, after all, is to create the most socially just society on earth? Can we do it without the mass violence, the mass social engineering that Stalin had practiced during the first half? And it's an open question whether the system can function and succeed and prosper without that mass use of violence by the state. That experiment is what makes it possible to have something like a dissident movement. That is, people who not so much openly criticize the government, but who develop a very clever technique for highlighting the government's shortcomings. And that's the technique that I want to describe to you today, and sort of how it was invented and how it evolved over time, the ways in which it was and wasn't successful, and most important for us who are alive today in 2025, what, if any, lessons can be drawn from that attempt to put constraints on the Soviet government from inside the system. So the story begins in the late 1950s, that's the prelude, with a very eccentric mathematician, a professor of mathematical logic named Alexander Volpin. I said he was a mathematical logician, which means he was interested in how you know whether certain mathematical statements are true. What does it mean to say something has been proven? What is the nature of completely certain mathematical knowledge? And like a lot of mathematicians and other scientists and scholars at this time, Volpin was interested in extending the clarity and the certainty of mathematics to other domains, first of research and then of life itself. And in particular, he was interested in creating a perfectly transparent language. It's part of a movement called ideal language philosophy. Ideal language is juxtaposed to what we call natural languages, like the one I'm speaking in now: English, French, Spanish, German, Swahili, Chinese. These are all languages which weren't invented by people, but evolved over many, many years with many, many participants and twists and turns. And one of the characteristics of natural or human languages, like the one I'm using now, is that they are full of ambiguity. Words have more than one meaning. That's what makes poetry possible, among other things. And words that have more than one meaning require you to use context to figure out which meaning is at play in any given setting. And Vulpen was one of the intellectuals of the mid-century, the mid-20th century, the 1950s and 60s, who thought so many of our human problems, the problems of war and peace, problems of miscommunication, problems of violence in society, are the result of the ambiguity of our language, of our inability to communicate with perfect clarity to each other, with the kind of clarity that mathematics offers. And so his quest was to invent a language which could express without any ambiguity at all what you are allowed to do, what you are prohibited from doing, and what you must do. Those are the three moral categories: things that you are required to do, forbidden to do, and allowed to do. He never succeeded in creating a perfect language like that, but because of his own personal experience, he bumped into what I would call a kind of plan B, a language that he thought was the next best thing. What was his personal experience? He was arrested for writing vaguely anti-Soviet jokes and poems that mocked Soviet propaganda. So he was put in jail. Once he was actually held inside a psychiatric institution, which was considered a moderate alternative to prison. But the long and short of it was that since he was spending so much time in jail, he had a chance to familiarize himself with the Code of Criminal Procedure and the Soviet Constitution and other sort of foundational legal documents. And he discovered that Soviet law itself actually contained some pretty robust, clear language about what was forbidden, what was required, and what was permitted. And he began to realize that he could use Soviet law as the next best thing to an ideal language. And when he got out, he decided that the main problem with the Soviet Union was that the government wasn't observing its own laws. If any of you ever have a chance, you can do this online, to open up the Soviet Constitution. There's the most famous and long-lasting one was from 1936. If you open up the Soviet Constitution, it's been translated into English and most other languages, you'll see that there are very impressive civil liberties there. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, all the kinds of things that we associate with the American Bill of Rights. It's true that they're embedded in a document that is about the building of a socialist society, so there's kind of a scaffolding around it which places certain limits on the interpretation of those civil liberties, but the civil liberties are there in extremely clear language. And Vulpen had the idea, this is the mathematician thinking, that if you could somehow actualize that language and persuade the Soviet government to live up to its own legal statutes, you could practice a kind of containment on the behavior of the Soviet government. You could make sure that the kind of mass terror, the mass arrests that were committed under Stalin would never happen again. That was the main goal, was to make sure that that kind of arbitrary sweeping up of innocent people, with the knock on your door at 2 a.m. and you're hauled out of your apartment and you're thrown into the back of a black van and you're hustled off to a prison somewhere. You have no lawyer. You are without rights, without any kind of rights, and utterly subject to the whims of your interrogator or whatever branch of the secret police is handling your case. That was what people wanted to escape from. So Vulpen had the idea that you could use Soviet law to contain the behavior of the Soviet state. And you could do that by publicly highlighting instances where the state failed to live up to its own law. It's a very clever strategy. It's not openly criticizing the Soviet government. It's simply saying, we demand absolute literal fulfillment of the law as it's written in the Constitution. If any of you are familiar with the martial art Aikido, does that ring any bells? Well, it's one of the Asian martial arts, and it's one that emphasizes using your opponent's weight against him or her. So not using your own force, but destabilizing your opponent by using his or her own weight. This is kind of the philosophy of using law. And here's where things get interesting. The dissident movement is unfolding in the 1960s. This is when it's sort of taking shape, gathering momentum. It goes through very important turning points, actually right during the time when that famous summit was held in that room right there, when the Soviet premier Alexei Kosygin was meeting with US President Lyndon Johnson, literally at the same time. This is New Jersey. This was happening in Moscow and Leningrad and Kiev and other Soviet cities. This is interesting because that is, of course, also part of the timeline of the American civil rights movement, which is unfolding in many different cities, not only in the South, but especially in the South of the United States. Now, if you've studied 20th century American history, you know that one of the main strategies of the American civil rights movement was what was known as civil disobedience. So racial discrimination was completely legal in places like Little Rock, Arkansas, Montgomery, Alabama. It was absolutely legal according to the local Jim Crow regime. And the way the civil rights activists combated that legal discrimination was by deliberately violating Jim Crow rules about where you could sit on a bus, where you could sit in a restaurant, which water fountains you could drink from, which bathrooms you could use, deliberately violating, that's the disobedience part, in an attempt to call attention to the inhumanity of those laws, and more importantly, bring in the federal government, because federal law, in this case, could trump local law. So the idea was this, almost like a legal choreography. You violate local law, you bring in the federal level, whether it's in the form of the Supreme Court or the National Guard or what have you, and that's how you combat what you consider these unjust local laws. Civil disobedience. It's a tradition that goes back to, well, of course, Martin Luther King made it famous in this country. It goes back to Mahatma Gandhi as part of the Indian anti-colonialist movement against the British Empire. It goes back to Leo Tolstoy, the famous Russian novelist who wrote War and Peace and who was a devout Christian and who believed that spiritual resistance to evil was the only right way to resist evil. It goes back to Henry David Thoreau in this country in the middle of the 19th century, a man who famously refused to pay taxes to a government that was waging a war that he thought was unjustified. Not paying taxes is being disobedient. You're breaking the law, but you're breaking the law to make a political point. Okay, I just took you on a little detour about civil disobedience. Why? Because the dissident technique was civil obedience. The idea that in all of their protest actions, they would strictly abide by Soviet law. They were not going to break Soviet laws. They were going to obey Soviet laws, particularly the civil liberties that were enshrined in the Soviet Constitution, in order to model what lawful behavior looked like and to either shame or pressure the Soviet state to do the same. And when I say protests, I mean they would have open letter campaigns where people would sign their names to a petition and in some cases put their addresses and phone numbers, which was a very scary thing to do in those days. It was like handing yourself on a silver platter to the KGB, telling them where you lived and how they could reach you. But they did that because the message they wanted to send was, what we are doing is fully legal, and therefore there's no basis for prosecuting or arresting us. Same thing with public gatherings. Peaceful public protest was protected, in theory, by the Soviet Constitution. And the idea was to model lawful behavior, and if the state came in and arrested people, to shame the state by pointing out that it was violating its own laws. It wasn't observing its own constitution. So Volpin is kind of the, let's call him the intellectual godfather of the movement. He's the one who thinks up this strategy. And the typical reaction to this strategy is, you must be out of your mind. Nobody in this country takes law seriously, least of all the KGB. So you're acting like a child who reads a constitution literally as if the Constitution is reality, but we all know it's not. And Volpin said, well, that's true now, but if enough people act as if, and the as if part is hugely important, if enough people act as if the Constitution is or should be reality, we will make it a reality. We will make those civil liberties real by acting on them. So he gets his first big break in the fall of 1965. What has happened? The previous general secretary of the Communist Party, the top dog in the system, the man who replaced Joseph Stalin. You may have heard of him, Nikita Khrushchev. He is essentially forced to resign from office. It's a complicated explanation. The Cuban Missile Crisis made the Soviet Union look weak. He was kind of erratic. People have had enough of him, so out he goes. And a collective trio of leaders takes his place. One of them is Alexei Kosygin, the guy who was in the room next door talking with Lyndon Johnson in 1967. And everybody's kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. Are they going to continue Khrushchev's liberalization? Because he's the guy who wanted to remove the use of terror and mass arrests and turn a page towards the second half of Soviet history. And it's looking bad, because in the fall of 1965, a year after Khrushchev was taken out of power, the KGB arrests 2 fiction writers and accuses them of having published their work abroad, France, United States, Germany, England, and that work consists in part of satirical short stories, they claim, mocking the Soviet system. This is alarming because it's been a long time since writers of fiction have been arrested. It reminds people of what happened in the darkest days of the 1930s under Joseph Stalin. And Volpin decides that this is his opportunity to start something, to put into practice this new philosophy of civil obedience and pressing for the rule of law. And he organizes what comes to be known as the Transparency Meeting. Now, most of the people in this room are probably too young to remember Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union. One of Gorbachev's slogans was, you guessed it, transparency, or he called it glasnost, and that's the word that the dissidents used. The idea that the Soviet system needed more light, more oxygen, it needed to expose wrongdoing in order to correct its ways. It was Volpin who put that word on the map in a political sense, and this transparency meeting was devoted not to demanding that the 2 writers be released, but to demanding that their trial be open to the public, open as in transparent, so that the whole legal procedure would be subject to scrutiny by ordinary citizens who could go in and watch. It was a very finely honed demand, which was not maximalist. It wasn't, you arrested the wrong people, these guys are innocent, how dare you touch great Russian writers. It was simply make the trial open. Let everybody watch the case that the prosecution makes. Do they have the evidence? Can they make the case for arresting these guys based on Soviet law rather than just political displeasure at what they wrote and published? Well, that trial is not really open. It's carefully managed by the KGB, and they stock the courtroom with their own people. But the wives of the 2 writers are admitted, and one of them is a linguist who is very, very good at shorthand notation. Her name is Larisa Bogoraz, and she manages to, very quietly in the back of the courtroom, create a handwritten transcript of the trial. Everything that was said, prosecution, witnesses, defense, defendants, the judge, everything, soup to nuts. And she manages to smuggle that transcript out, and it starts to circulate with a new technique that is becoming widespread in the Soviet Union, known as samizdat. Samizdat is a Russian word meaning self-published, as in it didn't pass through the censorship system that is required of everything that's published above ground in the Soviet Union. And people are retyping and copying this transcript of the trial, and essentially everybody does get to attend the trial because the transcript delivers it to them on thin paper hand-typed by an army of hundreds and hundreds of typists. And so Volpin sort of achieves his first victory. He's able to make the trial public, and the trial shows that the government is not observing its own laws. Now, the verdicts in the trials don't work out so well. The 2 writers are convicted. They are sentenced to 5 and 7 years, respectively, of hard labor. But the political outcome of the trial, or the public relations outcome of the trial, is the exact opposite. It shows that these writers are martyrs to a state that cannot even honor its own legal system. I'm going to speed through a lot of stuff because I want to leave time for questions and answers, but this trial ends up becoming the spark of a whole avalanche of similar trials. So with this transcript circulating by Samizdat, protests erupt against what has happened. Those protesters are arrested, they're put on trial, secret transcripts of those trials are made, those circulate, there are more protests, more arrests, and it's literally like an avalanche. And every one of these trials produces a guilty verdict, but every one of them makes the government look terrible, makes the government look hypocritical, and above all, it makes the government look like it can't handle a modern system. Like one of the hallmarks of a modern country, a modern government, is that it's a rule-abiding government. You can't just go off, well, now you can in the United States, but up until recently, you can't just go off and do whatever you want. There were legal constraints on what governments could do, and especially what police forces could do. So it made the government look really backward and kind of archaic. This is the period known as the chain reaction. More trials, more arrests, more bad publicity. And before you know it, you have over 1,000 people participating in these letter writing campaigns and in some cases in the public street protests. The movement is subject to lots of repression by the KGB. Unfortunately, its impact on the Soviet government, at least in the short term, was to make it less law-abiding. Because when Soviet leaders saw what was happening with these trials, how, yeah, they were getting their guilty verdicts, but the PR was terrible, it was making the dissidents into international heroes, it decided maybe we shouldn't use the court system to prosecute dissidents. Maybe we should just punish them on our own, like get them fired from their jobs, or make sure their children can't get into universities, or kick them out of their apartments. It started turning to a whole menu of extrajudicial, which is to say non-legal forms of punishment. But the genie was out of the bottle because the whole world, thanks to Western journalists who were stationed in Moscow and who were talking to the dissidents and covering their protests, the whole world learned about this movement. This is very much a Cold War phenomenon. And the Cold War, especially the Western side of the Cold War, loved nothing more than a story about kind of a David and Goliath struggle on the other side of the Iron Curtain, in the epicenter of the socialist system, in the Soviet Union itself. So some of the dissidents, the most famous ones, become literally household names. Two of them win the Nobel Prize. So in 1970, the writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who had fought in the Second World War, made the mistake of cracking a joke about Stalin in a letter to a friend, was sentenced to 8 years of hard labor for that letter, got out and started to write works of fiction and nonfiction about the Stalinist system. His most famous work, you may have heard of it, although it's over a half century old now, is the Gulag Archipelago, which is an account of this enormous network of essentially slave labor camps across the Soviet Union. So Solzhenitsyn is awarded the Nobel Prize in 1970. 5 years later, another important dissident, Andrei Sakharov, is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Sakharov, if anything, has an even more dramatic biography. He was a nuclear physicist and responsible more than any other single person for inventing the Soviet hydrogen bomb. So he gave Stalin the most lethal weapon in the Soviet arsenal. And he eventually came not to question his work on atomic weapons and nuclear weapons, but he started to take an interest in the radioactive fallout that occurs when you test nuclear weapons. And this was the beginning of his journey towards dissent. And he eventually joins the movement in 1968. So this is a movement that has many, many people in it. The Western media made some of them extremely famous by casting a very bright light on them. And when I say bright light, I mean front page of the New York Times. I mean the cover of Time magazine, back when people read Time magazine. I mean coverage on 60 Minutes, the CBS News program. These were literally household names. But the same intense spotlight that made a handful of people, and by the way, they were all men because those are the people that the journalists thought were worth covering, that same bright spotlight left a lot of other people in the movement in the shadows, which is what bright lights tend to do. They illuminate where they're focused and they leave everything else in the shadows. The book I wrote about the Soviet dissident movement, the subtitle is The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement. And I wanted to sort of capture the lives of the people who didn't get covered by the Western press, because I came away from my research in archives in Russia and Germany and the Netherlands and Israel and California and New York and various other places. I really came away with the impression that as great as figures like Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov were, they didn't actually make the movement. They were the marquee names, but they weren't the people who built the movement and who stuck with it for its roughly entire 20-year lifespan. Those are the people that I wanted to cover. Many of those people were women, and the women tended to get ignored by the Western journalists who made the fortunes of the super famous dissidents. The other meaning of the subtitle of the book, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, refers to the fact that the movement had several near-death experiences. There were multiple times when it was almost entirely snuffed out by the KGB, but each time it managed to not only resurrect itself, but to reformat itself in a kind of new idiom, a new way of carrying on the struggle that was rather different from the previous one. I won't go into all the details, but by the time we get to the late 1970s, the dissident movement looks a lot like an NGO, like a non-governmental organization. And in fact, it had started to build bridges to Western organizations that were carrying on similar kinds of work. I'm getting near the end of my time, but I want to come back to the American civil rights movement, which I used as a kind of touchstone, if only to highlight the contrast of techniques: civil disobedience on the American side, civil obedience on the Soviet side. Okay, so little known fact about the American civil rights movement. It didn't begin as a civil rights movement. It began as a human rights movement. It began in the hands of African American veterans who were returning from the Second World War, who were returning from a war against Nazism, or to put it differently, a war against a regime that was driven to conduct a racial genocide, and that had built a state, Nazi Germany, based on the idea of racial supremacy. And black veterans returning from that war developed what they called the double V strategy, the double victory strategy. Victory against racism abroad, that was the crushing of Nazi Germany, but also victory against racism at home. And they were using the language of international human rights to make that case. The problem with using international human rights as your idiom is that by the time you get to the late 1940s, early 1950s, international human rights are tainted by their association with the Soviet Union and with internationalism. So they have a problem, and the NAACP has a problem. It can't use this international language during the period of McCarthyism, when anything that has a whiff of association with the left wing of the political spectrum or with Moscow and the Soviet Union is suspect. So they reinvent themselves from a human rights movement into a civil rights movement that speaks in an American idiom, the idiom of equal opportunity, the American civil religion. A human rights movement becomes a civil rights movement, the one that we associate with people like Martin Luther King, whose rhetoric is absolutely American to its core. Again, I bring this to your attention by way of contrast. The Soviet dissident movement begins as a civil rights movement, invoking laws from the Soviet Constitution. It's trying to be as Soviet as it can be, as loyal to that Constitution as one can be. And it's only when that language fails to persuade the government to obey its own laws that the movement, in one of its several reinventions, remakes itself as a human rights movement. And now it's appealing to international human rights norms that the Soviet government has signed on to, has pledged itself to. This meant that there were other stakeholders in this contest, namely everybody else who had signed those human rights accords, including the United States. And now the dissidents could say the Soviet government is not only violating its own laws, it's breaking international human rights laws, and you guys are suckers if you let it get away with that because you signed those treaties too. That was a very powerful form of leverage, and that got them even more attention. Unfortunately, it also got them a lot more attention from the KGB because it was an unspoken rule of the Soviet system that the Kremlin and the Kremlin alone governed foreign policy. Nobody else was supposed to interfere with foreign policy. And the dissidents were seen as interfering in the Soviet Union's foreign relations, especially its relations with its superpower rival, this country. And that was ultimately their undoing. That's what got them in so much trouble, in so much hot water with the KGB, that the security services decided to crush the movement once and for all. And by 1982, essentially all of the major players had either been thrown in jail, a handful of them were killed, many of them were forced to leave the country. They were given the alternative, either you leave in 3 days or you're going to a hard labor camp for 7 years. And not surprisingly, many of them chose to leave. Or they were in internal exile, far, far away from Moscow. So the movement had been destroyed. And it was phenomenal when the last Soviet leader, a man who came to power in 1985, after the dissident movement was essentially over, that man being Mikhail Gorbachev, started to speak their language, or it seemed like their language, it sounded like their language. That's how they heard it. And his whole program of reform, of perestroika, of democratization and glasnost, transparency, the rule of law, all of this seemed to come from the dissident playbook. As you know, Gorbachev's reforms did not achieve their desired end. He never meant for the Soviet system to come apart. He wanted to make it better, but his reforms proved so destabilizing that it unraveled and collapsed in 1991, the year that Jim and I first met in Moscow. For a while, I used to pay very close attention to the afterlife of the Soviet dissident movement, the way it was remembered, the way it was invoked in post-Soviet Russia. But by the year 2021, 2022, Putin had clearly embarked on a campaign to annihilate all remaining traces of the movement. And now we know why. It was in anticipation of the invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. He wanted to preemptively get rid of all potential domestic critics of that invasion. And the institutional legacies of the dissident movement were where those critics lived. The Memorial Society, the Andrei Sakharov Center, the Moscow Helsinki Watch Group. They were all liquidated in the months leading up to the invasion. It's an open question whether the dissident legacy will be able to revive itself one day in Russia. But if it does, the story of that movement will be waiting for people who are interested in using it as part of their own pedigree. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, for a great talk. So we'd like to open up the floor now for questions. And whoever answers a question, if you would use this microphone so we can record it. So does anybody have any questions? Who would like to ask the first question?
Can you tell us a little bit about how you did your research, when you did it, where you listed all the locations, but I'm especially interested in what you did in Russia. I know Jim has talked about challenges of doing his research.
Yeah.
What kind of sources did you have?
Sure. Thank you. So I mentioned that a lot of dissidents ended up leaving the country under duress, which means that they and their paper trails are a gigantic diaspora. There's a dissident diaspora. They're all over the place.
Because they got out of the country.
Yes, they exist because they left, and those who could took papers with them. So one important source was people's personal collections. And they just ended up, I wouldn't say in random places, but quite dispersed. So there's a famous archive at Stanford University called the Hoover Archive that is very wealthy and is able to buy collections from individuals. They have a fantastic collection. One of the dissidents, I think his granddaughter went to Amherst College, and so before he died, he donated his papers. He was actually a general in the Soviet Army who joined the movement, which was an incredible thing. He donated his papers to Amherst College. An American guy who I became friends with named Ed Klein, who lived in New York, started helping Soviet dissidents. He was in the men's clothing business, but he was very interested in Russian history, and he was able to help a lot of dissidents when they came to this country penniless. And his own personal archive, which I used at his apartment in New York, was also quite valuable. I couldn't do the next part of my research today because, as I mentioned, the institutional legacies of the dissident movement were destroyed. But I did a lot of the research for this book before the invasion of Ukraine, and there were non-state archives in both Moscow and St. Petersburg that were sort of gathering places for dissident papers. I mentioned this eccentric mathematician, Alexander Volpin. His diaries were in this archive of the organization known as Memorial. And I nearly fell out of my chair when I opened that box because I was watching his thought process develop in real time in the 1950s and 60s. And I could watch him arriving at this extremely counterintuitive strategy of civil obedience. It was one of those eureka moments that historians live for. The final kind of collection that I'll mention is very special. No organization in the world paid more attention and had more of a stake in gathering information about the dissident movement in real time than the KGB. That was the nemesis of the movement. The KGB has a vast archive in Moscow, which I will never set foot in because they won't let me. But this is the good part. When the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, it consisted of a bunch of different ethnic republics. So there was the Russian Republic, but there was also the Ukrainian Republic, and the Lithuanian Republic, and the Armenian, and the Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan, and Belarus, 15 different constituent elements in this union of Soviet socialist republics. When that country broke up, every one of those republics had a branch of the KGB in it. And every one of those branches had an archive. And every one of those branches had communicated back and forth with headquarters in Moscow. And several of those republics were only too happy to welcome foreigners to come in and show them how terrible the Soviet Union had been to them by going through the papers of the KGB. So I made 2 research trips to the capital of the former Lithuanian Socialist Republic, now independent Lithuania, and they pretty much rolled out the red carpet for me to work with the former KGB collection. So even though I can't get into the Moscow motherlode, I got in the back door through Lithuania. And similarly in Kyiv, the capital of independent Ukraine, there's an enormous collection of KGB materials. It's a gold mine for historians. Not so safe to work there right now because of the bombs and the drones, but it's an absolutely spectacular collection, and in the future, it will be a tremendous resource for anyone wanting to work on not just Ukrainian, but Soviet history.
Thank you.
Sure.
Is there any numbers the population of the movement as per se?
Yeah.
Oh.
That's a deceptively simple question that's not so easy to answer. So the movement was tiny if you take it as a percentage of the whole Soviet population. So the Soviet population, let's just say in 1970, is about 250 million people. It's a really big country. I would say the maximum number of people who ever participated in a public demonstration or put their name to one of those open petitions or created a samizdat article to distribute below the radar of the censorship system, I'd say there were about 1,000. Not much. 1,000 people is a drop of water in the ocean of the Soviet population. However, if you're asking me how many people read samizdat, how many people were members of the network within which those illegal texts flowed, then we're talking about tens of thousands of people. How do I know that? The KGB did my research for me. They wanted to know how many people were reading samizdat and where were they. And what they found, and I believe them because they did their homework, was that tens of thousands of people were part of this network, and they were in cities all across the country. I really should say all across the country, because the Soviet Union, like Russia today, has 11 time zones. It's over 6,000 miles wide. You can take 5 of the continental United States, we're going to leave out Alaska, you can take 5 of the continental United States and they'll all fit inside the Soviet Union. So it is a ginormous country, and yet samizdat was making its way to every major city and town. If you want to expand the circle even more, bear in mind that quite a significant number of samizdat texts got smuggled abroad. Diplomats who had diplomatic privileges could take them out of the country. Western journalists would smuggle them. Sometimes tourists who were visiting the Soviet Union, and there were quite a few in the 70s, would take samizdat texts out with them. And some of those texts made their way to shortwave radio stations financed by Western governments. You will have heard of some of their names: the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, the BBC. The Germans had the Deutsche Welle. The Israelis had Kol Yisrael, the Voice of Israel. All of these were radio stations that were broadcasting on shortwave, so long distance. You know, they could go thousands of miles. And while nobody has airtight numbers, the anecdotal evidence is overwhelming that millions, possibly tens of millions, of Soviet citizens were listening to those broadcasts. And some of those broadcasts were what we would now call audiobooks. They would read dissident essays and articles from samizdat over the airwaves. So that's a very long, multi-tiered answer to your question about the numbers. It all depends on how you define, participant in the movement.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, I'm Ed Wang. I'm a colleague of Jim in the department. Yeah, I'm curious about what you said in the beginning, maybe that your main argument that Soviet history can be divided into 2 periods, Stalin era and the post-Stalin era. And then you say that in the post-Stalin era, then the leaders all wanted to make Soviet Union sort of like more open and stronger, and try to prove their system is better. Then, so if that's the case, then you are saying that Gorbachev is sort of like continuing this legacy, and of course push it to a very radical kind of extent. Then that's the outcome. So I just wonder the connections between those post Stalin era leaders.
Yep.
And their relationship with what Gorbachev was doing.
Sure. So let me try to fill in the picture a little bit. So I mentioned that the great experiment was, can you run this system without relying on mass terror, mass arrests, imprisonments, executions? But the things that didn't change in that experiment, well, there are 2 of them basically. It continued to be a one-party system. One and only one party would ever have a say in the government. There was no open political competition by any element outside the Communist Party. That didn't change. And the other thing that didn't change was that the centrally planned economy remained centrally planned. There was no concession, no significant concession to market forces, to independent entrepreneurial behavior, to private property owners or anything of the sort. As a matter of fact, by yielding on the use of political terror, they really had to sort of shore up the other 2 pillars of the system: one-party rule, command economy. The performance under that experiment was mixed. I personally believe that the Soviet Union could have gone on for another 50 years if Gorbachev hadn't tried to fix it. The country was not falling apart. It really wasn't. It wasn't performing so well, and it was slipping in its ability to compete with the United States and other Western countries. There's no question that it was losing ground, whether your metric is economic competition or scientific innovation or technological growth. It was not winning those contests. After it, for a while, it looked like it was going to win them. The first country to send a satellite into space, first country to send a human being in a rocket ship that would circle the Earth. They lost the space race, they lost the microchip computer race, but they weren't falling apart. They were slowing down. What Gorbachev wanted to do was to revive the system by tinkering with one-party rule and command economy. And one of the things that's extraordinary about Gorbachev is that he learns on the job. He actually changes his mind about certain things while he's running the country. He's growing in office. And he comes to the realization at some point that the Communist Party is an obstacle to reform. And he's going to have to go over the heads of the party and appeal directly to the population in order to gather momentum for the kinds of changes that he wants to enact. And he starts to think that the command economy has outlived its usefulness. It is increasingly producing a kind of rust belt feeling in the Soviet Union, and he's going to have to loosen the laws on ownership of private property and on people's ability to start their own businesses and essentially have a kind of mixed, half capitalist, half socialist economy. He's a very bold thinker. And one of the boldest things that he does is to come to the conclusion that the Soviet Union can only repair and rejuvenate its economy if it reduces the heat of the Cold War competition with the West. And so he unilaterally withdraws from Afghanistan. He unilaterally offers to reduce the Soviet nuclear stockpile. Extremely bold thinking. The kind of thing that very few American presidents have had the political capital or the will to try to accomplish. But as we know, that very bold thinking produced a set of reforms that ended up destroying the system rather than rejuvenating it. But he's building on the second half of Soviet history. He's continuing the experiment in another level.
Hello, my name is Gregoria, and I am a student from the International Studies Seminar.
Hi.
And I'm interested in knowing what was your main motivation for this research, and if you ever faced any moments of frustration where you felt like the book wasn't progressing, or you were getting shut off where you tried to do your research at.
How much time do you have? What was my main motivation in writing this book? I became interested in how people who live in non-democratic authoritarian societies think about their political options, and especially how they think about their options for political engagement. I wanted to know how they, what they saw their choices as being. And there was no better place for me to start than the Soviet Union, because it had been around for a long time. I had already started studying Russian at that point. I was an exchange student, as Jim said, in 1987, and that was just an incredibly eye-opening experience. I'd never lived in a place that was so different from where I grew up. I'm from Baltimore, so I grew up, just down the highway from here. And what I saw in the Soviet Union was, to call it exotic would be an understatement. It was just radically different. So that was the natural arena, and those questions about how people in authoritarian societies think about how can I be politically effective, that's what motivated me. I should also say that a very high proportion of Soviet dissidents wrote autobiographies, and those are fantastic sources to work with because it combines the human story with the politics of the history of the movement. And I love doing history that way. Weaving the personal with the political. It's just, that's where it is for me. That's where it happens. Was I ever frustrated? Oh my God, so many times. When you go to an archive, it's like sifting for gold. 90% of what you find is just crud. It's just useless. So you're just looking and looking and looking, and then every once in a while, like when I found the diaries of Alexander Volpin, it's just this thrill of discovery. But along the way, there's a lot of frustration in the research. And of course, writing is really hard. There's just no other way to describe it. I like to say, I love having written. Writing itself, not so much. But I love having written. So there were a million times when I was feeling like I didn't know where the story was going, or I didn't have enough evidence. It wasn't thick enough for me to really make something out of it. Certain chapters had to be abandoned because they just weren't coming together. But I stuck with it. I finally finished, and it's a book.
Hi, my name is Joy. I'm also a student from the International Studies Seminar. You mentioned something earlier regarding like how the Soviet Union could have survived if Gorbachev honestly did not try to interfere with his own form or with his own sense of like reform with trying to create like a half capitalist, half socialist system. Yep. So to kind of like follow up with that question, do you believe that if the Soviet Union were able to survive, maybe let's say without Gorbachev's sort of like interventions, would they be able to progress towards greater policy that would then help them to even progress higher than the United States? Or in your opinion, do you think they would try to revert back to, I guess, their more, how should I say, their former policies where it's definitely Rust Belt, a lot more repressive, a lot more of an iron fist on the means of production as well as the means of civil society?
Yeah. Obviously, it's a tricky question because it's a what-if question. You know, it's a hypothetical. What if we subtract Gorbachev from the equation? What would have happened? And nobody can really say for sure. I think what was likely to have happened was that the country would have continued to sort of slowly decline in terms of its productivity and its GDP and its living standard, which means it would have fallen further and further behind the rival powers, which would have placed it under more and more geopolitical pressure. I have to believe that some of the non-Russian ethnic groups that lived in the Soviet Union would have pressed harder and harder for more autonomy and maybe full-scale independence. That could have triggered a war. I mean, you know, the wars that Russia has fought under Putin have all been with former Soviet groups like the Georgians, now like the Ukrainians. So it was a remarkably peaceful collapse, but in a sense what they did was delay the day of reckoning with the breakup of this empire. But the Soviet Union, you know, it still had, in 1985, when Gorbachev came to power, it had one of the largest stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons, nuclear weapons. It had a very large population. It had a very technically literate population. I mean, one of the reasons why so many people could get those shortwave radio broadcasts is that a lot of people had enough engineering skills, or STEM skills as we would call them now, to convert a regular FM radio to a shortwave radio. It was a very well-educated population, thanks to the Communist Party's campaigns of mass literacy and mass education. So those, you know, the human talent and the educational level were not going to just disappear overnight. So I think it would have remained a viable state probably for decades. Would it have reverted to Stalinist-style repressions? Wow, I mean, those were so extreme, really unprecedented. It's hard to imagine those returning. Even what Putin's doing now in Russia, I know people like to compare him to Stalin, but he's really nothing like Stalin. I mean, you know, Stalin sent 18 million people to the Gulag. Putin has, you know, maybe, he's arrested about 30,000 people for protesting against the war. Most of them, I'm not trying to trivialize this, but most of them got relatively short prison sentences, you know, less than 2 years. Under Stalin, people were sentenced to the Gulag for 25 years, and some of them never made it back because they starved to death, they froze to death, they were worked to death. We're a long way away from that, and I hope we stay a long way away from that.
I'm Mario. I'm from Dr. Ake's senior seminar class.
Hi.
My question is, earlier you mentioned how this spotlight was really shown on some of these eccentric figures, I guess, and how they took a lot of the media attention. Most of them were male. Did that allow some of these more like figures that were pushed in the back to be more effective? Like, did the KGB have these same kind of presumptions that only men were the ones doing it, or did they go after everybody more effectively?
Really interesting question. In general, the conventional wisdom at the time, and I'm inclined to think it was right, was that the better known you were in the West, the more protection you had against the KGB. Because they didn't want the bad publicity that went along with persecuting famous people. Sakharov was in a special case because as the inventor of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, he knew way too much about the Soviet nuclear program to be kicked out of the country. It just wasn't an option. So they knew that they couldn't use that technique against him. And I've actually read the transcripts of the discussions in the Politburo, which is the highest organ of the Communist Party, basically like 12 guys making the decisions for the country. I've read the transcripts of some of those conversations, what do we do with Sakharov? What do we do with Solzhenitsyn? And it was a real conundrum for them. They didn't want to put them on trial because the publicity would be huge and that would just call attention to how lawless the system was. They certainly didn't want to expel Sakharov from the country because of how much he knew. They considered internal exile. You send them to Siberia where there are no Western journalists and they're essentially off the radar screen. And they went back and forth and back and forth. And what was so interesting in these discussions is that ultimately the conversation was not about, well, what does our legal system dictate that we do with somebody who we claim, committed crime X, Y, and Z? It was never about the law. It was always about political expediency. What will make us look strong and what will make us look weak? And some would argue if you expel Solzhenitsyn, it makes you look weak. Like you're not willing to face him off, man to man. And others argued, no, you can expel him and then he'll be forgotten. And that's kind of what happened. They expelled Solzhenitsyn in 1974, and he made his way to Vermont, and he became a hermit for the next 20 years. Well, I shouldn't say a hermit, he was a writer. He was incredibly prolific, but he was much less visible the second he landed on American soil. So being famous was a form of insurance, in a way. Did the KGB go after women? So Russia then is a fairly patriarchal society with certain qualifications. Women were brought into the workforce and higher education much earlier than they were in this country. So I don't want to paint this as just a simple black and white picture. But in general, the top leadership were all male. The KGB was certainly dominated by men. They did occasionally arrest women, and occasionally they put them in jail or sent them into internal exile. But in general, they took the men more seriously as a threat. And there's a famous instance of one of the most famous demonstrations of the dissident movement occurred on August 25th, 1968, and it was a protest against the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia that had happened 4 days earlier on August 21st. This was to crush the reform movement in Czechoslovakia. And 8 extraordinarily brave individuals went out on Red Square, which is like the symbolic epicenter of the Soviet universe. And they held up signs saying, hands off Czechoslovakia, we sympathize with the Czechoslovakian freedom fighters, and they were instantly arrested. And they became almost godlike figures in the movement because of the bravery that they'd exhibited. So 3 of those 8 people were women, and 2 of them were arguably the organizers, to the extent that there was any organization involved, organizers of that protest. And one of them showed up in Red Square with her 3-month-old baby in a baby carriage. Her name was Natalia Gorbanevskaya. She was a poet. And the KGB could not stomach the idea of putting a nursing mother on trial. Like the men in the system just thought, that's gonna make us look so bad because she's just gonna get so much sympathy. So what did they do? They sent her to a psychiatric hospital for indefinite confinement. And that way there didn't need to be a trial and there didn't need to be publicity. So that, I think, is a telling example of what you're asking about.
Does anyone have a question? If not, I'm going to ask a question. So we haven't talked yet about the war in Ukraine. I'd just like to ask you, so we're at a kind of turning point, perhaps, in the war with a new administration that has very different ideas about how to support Ukraine and about America's role in Europe in general, Europe, most of which supports the Ukrainian side. So if somebody from the state, maybe this has happened, if somebody from the State Department called you and said, we'd like your advice, we'll pass this advice on to the president about what your reading of the situation is now, or what you'd like, the president to know from a specialist on Russia, what would you say? I know it's a big nut to crack, but you can do it.
What would I say? I guess the first thing I would say is that I am sympathetic to the idea of trying to bring closure to the war. The whole question is on what terms, on whose terms, and with what kind of border separating the Ukraine from Russia. The Russian war effort since the full-scale invasion of February 2022 has been extremely consistent with the Russian pattern across the 20th century. When Russians go to war, they tend to be very inefficient. It takes them a long time to get their bearing, but when they do, they have tremendous staying power, even as they're suffering huge losses of human life, of materiel, and of their treasury. The Second World War was a classic case where they just got slaughtered by the Germans for the first couple of years. But they, unlike all the other European countries, they didn't give up. They didn't surrender. Excuse me, and they were eventually able to turn the tide. And with unfathomable losses, 25 million people killed, another 25 million people left homeless, they turned the war around and they fought the Germans all the way back to Berlin. So there was a lot of celebratory hype in this country about how badly the Russian military was performing during the first months of the war. And it really was pretty bad. I mean, we were, the CIA seemed to have access to every cell phone owned by every Russian general, and we knew where they were and when they were going to go places, and we were helping the Ukrainians to pick them off. But it was only a matter of time until the Russians got their bearing. And this is a very unequal, asymmetric contest. It's asymmetric in terms of the resources that the countries can bring to bear. It's asymmetric in terms of the population of draftable young men. So it's a really lopsided contest. What I would say to whoever thought it wise to call me from the State Department, Marco Rubio, yeah. What I would say was that if you abandon Ukraine, the Russians will get far more than they should in any reasonable settlement on the ground, and that it will be a disgrace to the United States for having abandoned an ally. And I want to remind everybody that in 1994, the United States, Great Britain, Russia, and Ukraine signed a memorandum known as the Budapest Memorandum, under which the Ukrainians agreed to give up all of their nuclear weapons, which were leftovers from the Soviet era, in exchange for which all of the other signatories to that memorandum guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Now, when you annex the Crimean Peninsula and you try to bite off 20% of the eastern territory of Ukraine, as Putin has done, you are massively violating the territorial integrity of that country. And if the United States allows that to happen and gives its seal of approval to that kind of behavior, it is going to lose credibility as an international actor. And that is something we absolutely should not do. So I'm very worried, frankly, about what's going to happen to Ukraine. I don't know what Donald Trump's game plan is. I doubt he's asking Marco Rubio. I think he's asking himself. I mean, his idea of a meeting is you stand in front of a mirror, and that's the meeting. So I don't know what goes on in his head. I don't know what his game plan is, but the signs are very worrisome, very worrisome. I will say this: if Trump sells Ukraine down the river, the Russians may gain a lot of territory, but they're going to have a guerrilla partisan warfare on their hands for years to come. And it's going to be nasty. It could be just as nasty as the war that's going on right now. So the prognosis is not good, I'm afraid to say.
All right, well, thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for coming on this chilly